Welcome to the 5-Minute English Vocabulary Podcast. My name is Herbert Lee, and I'll be your host. Now you can easily improve your vocabulary without memorizing long lists of boring words, and still develop a powerful command of English. You'll learn the origin of words, or etymology, told as easy-to-remember stories. You'll also hear some jokes, and learn some idioms as well. Episode 1. Hi, and welcome to 5-Minute English Vocabulary Podcast. In this first episode, I want to share some valuable ideas on the best ways to improve your English vocabulary, and how to get the most out of these podcasts. This is a special episode and will be longer than 5 minutes. If you really want to improve your vocabulary, you'll want to listen until the very end. I'm sharing some very important research on how the brain learns vocabulary. And when you understand these ideas, you will change the way you are learning vocabulary. And you will get better results. My name is Herbert Lee, and I'll be your host. If you have struggled with learning English vocabulary, here's good news. I've been an English learner my entire life, and an English teacher for over 15 years. Since English is my second language, I have a very good understanding of the challenges of learning English as a second language. Like many of you, I had to learn English vocabulary. I didn't pick it up naturally from my environment. Even though I was born and raised in Canada, I grew up in a non-English speaking household. It was not until I went to school that I began to study English. Fortunately for me, I had excellent teachers in school. They stressed the value of using words correctly and using language in a clear manner. More importantly, they helped me develop a love of the English language. Before we begin, let's do an assessment. This is very important, so don't skip ahead. If you're listening to this podcast and you can understand 60 to 70% of what I'm saying without using any dictionary, you're in the right place. Now, if you understand more than 90% of this podcast, then this podcast is too simple for you, and you should find a more difficult and challenging podcast. On the other hand, if you understand less than 60 to 70% of what I'm saying without using any dictionary, you will struggle to understand, and you should probably find a podcast that is more easy for you to understand. There's been a lot of research that shows listening exercises should be in the range of 60 to 70% of understanding to be effective. If you're higher or lower than that level, you need to go either higher or lower and find podcasts that are more suited to you if you want to get better results. This podcast will not have any manuscripts or subtitles. It's a podcast. Subtitles are for beginning learning students, and if you are still using subtitles and manuscripts, and you're an intermediate or advanced learner, you are actually slowing down your progress. Subtitles and manuscripts are like training wheels for learning how to ride a bicycle, or flotation boards when you learn to swim. At some point, you needed to get rid of your training wheels and floating boards if you really wanted to ride a bicycle or learn how to swim. In that same way, you need to get rid of subtitles if you really want to listen well. You learn to become a very fast reader of subtitles, and you never learn to listen. And you must learn to listen well, to listen actively if you want to have a face-to-face conversation. In a face-to-face conversation, there are no subtitles. Now let's get back to some research. I know many English learners depend on the internet or YouTube to learn English. That's absolutely great. There's so much available online to help you learn English. But that's the problem. The biggest fault of trying to learn English that way, you should develop what I call a grasshopper brain. You jump from one thing to another, and you never really master anything. So one week you think, oh, I should practice my vocabulary. And then the next week, maybe I should start doing something about pronunciation. And then maybe I should do some work with my grammar. Or maybe I should start working on my writing skills. But you don't stick to something long enough to really master any of these skills by jumping around like a grasshopper. Only if you learn to focus your attention on one thing at a time and put a lot of effort into it will you really master that skill. Since you've made up your mind to spend more time just learning vocabulary, let me share some ideas about how we actually learn vocabulary. This is based on research from 1955 by Mr. Edgar Dale, one of the very early pioneers in research on how we learn vocabulary. Mr. Dale found that there are 4 levels of learning vocabulary. 1. I don't know the word. 2. I've seen the word and have looked it up in a dictionary. 3. I know the meaning of the word when I read, but I'm not completely confident to use the word in speaking and writing. And 4, I am completely confident to use the word in speaking and writing. According to Dale's research, it takes at least 12 exposures for the word to go into short-term memory and have a basic understanding of the word. So if you look up a word in the dictionary, you get to level 2. To reach level 3, you start using the word in your writing or speaking. Here's the but. But seeing a word, being exposed to a word one time, and thinking, I've learned a new word. That's totally incorrect. Oh, on the subject of dictionaries, are you using an English-to-English dictionary, or are you using an English-to-native language dictionary? If you're still using an English-to-native language dictionary to learn English vocabulary, you're making a big mistake. There's absolutely no way you will ever improve your English vocabulary using an English-to-native language dictionary. You've basically short-circuited the system. Remember we said the learning process, level 2, is looking it up in a dictionary, but that means an English-to-English dictionary. And level 3 is you know the meaning of a word when you read it, but you're not comfortable to use it in your writing or speaking. So if you only know the word in your native language, how will you use that word in your English writing and speaking? It's absolutely impossible. So one thing you must absolutely do if you really want to improve your English vocabulary is to say goodbye to your old friend, the English-to-Native Language Dictionary. Just like subtitles, English-to-Native Language dictionaries are like training wheels or flotation devices. They should be used in the beginning stages when you first start to learn English. However, if you really want to become fluent and proficient in English, particularly when you speak English, you need to get rid of them. It's understandable why you want to use an English-to-native dictionary. When you're in a classroom and the teacher uses a word in English you don't know, so you look it up and you can see what it means in your native language. It's quick, it's easy, but it's absolutely no good for your long-term English vocabulary development. So let's get back to some research about learning vocabulary. What does the research tell us are the best ways to learn vocabulary? Absolutely on top of the list is reading and listening to stories is one of the most powerful and proven ways to master vocabulary quickly. There are words in the story you will not understand right away. However, if you actively listen and you listen repeatedly, you will get it. And if you understand 60 to 70% of what is being said, yes, 60 to 70%, if you already understand that much, your brain can guess the other 30 to 40%. Your brain can guess the meaning of the word just by how it's used. The rest of the words in the sentence give clues to the brain. You don't need a dictionary. Just give it a chance. That's why I recommend the podcast for people who can understand 60 to 70% without using a dictionary. This is exactly how children learn. Most of the vocabulary in your native language you learned and acquired by listening to your parents, watching television and movies, and picking up vocabulary in a very natural way. Think about this. When you were a child, you didn't carry around a dictionary and look up a word when you didn't know what it meant. You just let it go. And eventually you listened more, again and again, and finally you knew what it meant, naturally. The second effective strategy for learning vocabulary is clustering. Learn words in groups or chunks. Your brain likes listening to chunks of information, words that are related to one particular area or topic. Words are put into a container in your brain, and they're filed forever. That's why lists of random words don't work very well. And that's why stories work so well, because the stories contain natural chunks or clusters of words. Other clusters of words can also be collocations, phrasal verbs, or groups of words that are based on a particular idea or theme. Finally, learn vocabulary by listening to jokes. No kidding. I remember when I was growing up in Canada and telling jokes to each other on the playground. You can learn a lot of vocabulary from jokes, because jokes use different meanings of words. You need to understand the different meanings to understand the joke. If you think of a word as only having one meaning, which is what they teach you in school, you never understand the joke. You have to use your brain to understand the joke, and that's the magic of listening to jokes. So that's why I've designed the 5-minute English vocabulary to include jokes. So the three-pronged approach in the 5-minute English vocabulary podcast is to tell you stories about the origin of words, which in English is called etymology. Listening to these stories, you will hear new words, some of which you will not understand. But because your brain wants to understand it, it will guess the words that you don't understand. That's because you want to understand the story. When children watch cartoons, their vocabulary improves, because they're using their brain to guess the meaning of words just by watching and listening. But it's a skill we forget that we have as adults. Secondly, each episode will contain a theme or idea. So this follows the principle I talked about earlier about clustering or chunking. Words that are related to one particular subject will make the words go into your memory almost effortless. Your brain actually will create folders or compartments to hold the words in a particular group or chunk. And finally, I'll be telling you 8 to 10 jokes in each episode. These jokes are based on the theme or idea of that episode, again using chunking. Again, you need to let your brain figure it out. After you hear the joke, it may take a few minutes to get it, or a few hours, maybe even a few days. Just let the joke sit there in your brain and let it figure it out. Don't use a dictionary. But I guarantee, when you get it, you'll jump out of your seat and say, I got it. That's the magic of jokes. You use your brain to learn vocabulary, to understand the vocabulary. This is a very powerful way to learn English vocabulary. I recommend you listen to the podcast for a week, once a day for 7 days, since this is a weekly podcast. And if you want to do more to improve your English vocabulary, besides listening to this podcast, I also suggest you to watch and listen to children's cartoons in English without subtitles, and listen actively and repeatedly. When you watch and listen, I guarantee it's easy to guess the words that are being used. It's the same way children learn naturally. So that's how I created the 5-minute English vocabulary podcast, and how you can learn English vocabulary easily just by listening every day for 7 days. Subscribe now if you think this podcast is for you, to get my podcast every week. This is Herbert Lee saying bye for now, and hope you enjoy your English learning vocabulary journey.